Imagine the final years of the Cold War. The Soviet Union is approaching collapse. Budgets are collapsing with it. Yet, deep inside Russia's most secret design bureaus, engineers are still sketching the outlines of a fighter jet they believe could change the future of aviation. A machine so unconventional that even its wings would point the wrong way. But long before the world ever heard the name Su-47, the story began with something even more ambitious: the dream of a powerful Soviet naval aviation force. During the early 1980s, the Soviet Navy faced a strategic dilemma. The United States Navy dominated the oceans with carrier groups, cutting-edge fighters, and the world's largest fleet of nuclear-powered carriers. Moscow wanted to challenge that dominance, not just with submarines and missiles, but with aircraft that could protect the USSR's enormous coastlines and project power over the northern seas. To achieve this, the USSR needed a next-generation naval fighter, something more capable than the Su-27 and MiG-29, and more sophisticated than any aircraft ever operated from a Soviet deck. The answer, at least on paper, was a project designated S-22, later renamed Su-27KM, a supposed fifth-generation carrier-based fighter intended to operate alongside the Yak-141, the USSR's attempt at a vertical short takeoff jet. The project was so secretive that even its name was chosen to mislead Western intelligence. But inside the Sukhoi bureau, the mood was electric. Designers believed they could leapfrog not only the West but also their rival Mikoyan Design Bureau. Sukhoi engineers began to experiment with radical aerodynamic layouts, exotic materials, and technologies the Soviet industry had barely begun to master. A full-scale mock-up of the Su-27KM was actually built, complete with a unique flat rectangular exhaust system meant to reduce radar visibility. For late Soviet aviation, this was astonishingly forward-looking. But as the engineers worked, the world around them was collapsing. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, nearly every advanced military aviation project was frozen or cancelled outright. Funding disappeared overnight. The ambitious Su-27KM was shelved before a prototype could be built. Defense factories were suddenly without orders. Engineers left the industry in waves, and several legendary design bureaus were on the brink of bankruptcy. Most programs died then and there. But Sukhoi refused to let this idea go. In the chaos of the 1990s, the Sukhoi leadership saw an unexpected opportunity. Their longtime rivals at Mikoyan had won the official government tender to build Russia's next-generation fighter, the MiG-144. Yet that project was already drowning in financial difficulties. Sukhoi realized that if they could produce something extraordinary on their own, without waiting for government money, they might be able to seize control of the future. This wasn't just technical ambition. It was a fight for survival. The company began secretly reworking the old Su-27KM concept into something far more radical. They wanted a research aircraft, a demonstrator of technologies that Russia would eventually need for any fifth-generation program. And at the center of that vision was a wing design that had haunted aviation engineers since World War II: the forward-swept wing. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. Forward-swept wings promised lower drag, better maneuverability at high angles, and superior agility in dogfights, but historically they had always failed. The forces acting on the wings would twist them apart in midair. Only newly emerging composite materials could make such a design even remotely feasible. Sukhoi engineers knew that Western nations were exploring the same idea, especially after the American Grumman X-29 began testing in 1984. If Russia didn't act now, they would fall decades behind. Inside dimly lit design offices, surrounded by outdated computers and drawing boards left over from the Soviet era, a small team of engineers made their decision. They would build the impossible, even with no official funding. And so, the old S-22 concept evolved into an entirely new aircraft, an internal Sukhoi project designated S-37. It was a desperate gamble, but also a remarkable act of faith in Russian engineering. Sukhoi leadership knew that if this experiment succeeded, they could not only surpass their rivals at MiG, but also reshape the foundation of Russia's future fighter programs. The engineers began assembling a team, pulling in aerodynamicists, composite specialists, and test pilots who still believed Russia could build world-class aircraft even in the darkest economic years. They reused parts from the Su-27 family to lower costs, but pushed far beyond anything previously attempted in Russian aviation. The dream of a Soviet naval fighter had died, but from its ashes, something even more extraordinary was beginning to take shape. A machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. A machine that would soon take flight under a new name, the Su-47 Berkut. If the Su-47 looked like something from another world, it's because its story didn't begin in Russia at all. To understand how Sukhoi's engineers dared to bend the laws of aerodynamics, we must wind the clock back half a century, to a moment when the world was burning and aviation was advancing at a terrifying pace. It was 1944, and the Third Reich was desperate. Allied bombers pounded German cities day and night, and the Luftwaffe was losing control of the skies. In a last attempt to regain the initiative, German engineers unveiled an experimental jet bomber with wings that pointed forward, a design so unusual that Allied pilots who spotted it were convinced it had to be a prototype, or even a decoy. This aircraft was the Junkers Ju-287, and it was the first real attempt to build a forward-swept wing jet. The idea was groundbreaking: improve maneuverability at low speeds, reduce drag at high speeds, and increase stability during takeoff and landing. On paper, the benefits were clear, but in practice, the technology of the 1940s simply wasn't ready. The wings bent and twisted under load, and the materials of the era couldn't withstand the forces generated in flight. The aircraft flew, but the concept could not be developed further. Yet the idea didn't die on the ruins of the Third Reich. It spread. When the war ended, Allied engineers, American, British, and Soviet, studied every captured design. The Ju-287 attracted enormous attention. For the Soviet aviation community in particular, it was a revelation. Here was a concept they believed could someday unlock performance that traditional swept wings could never achieve. And while the technology was not ready yet, the seed had been planted. In the following decades, Soviet scientists continued to circle around the idea, returning to it again and again in classified studies, wind tunnel experiments, and small-scale prototypes. The concept resurfaced in the 1950s, then in the 1960s with research linked to the DBLK program. But each time, engineers hit the same wall. The wing simply couldn't survive the aerodynamic forces without tearing themselves apart. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States was making its own attempts. For years, the idea of forward-swept wings sat quietly in research files, a kind of holy grail of experimental aerodynamics, waiting for materials strong enough to make it practical. That moment came in the late 1970s, when composite materials, lightweight, strong, and resistant to twisting forces, began appearing in cutting-edge aerospace projects. The breakthrough finally arrived in 1984, when Grumman unveiled the X-29. Sleek, futuristic, and almost alien in appearance, the X-29 became the first aircraft truly capable of flying with forward-swept wings using advanced carbon fiber composites. It wasn't designed for combat, its purpose was pure experimentation, but its success proved that the concept could work. It also sent a shockwave through the global aviation community. And yes, it got Russia's attention. At exactly this moment, the Soviet Union was launching two of its most ambitious aviation programs since World War II: MFI, a heavy multi-role fighter, and LFI, a light tactical fighter. The goal was clear: create aircraft competitive with the American ATF program, which would later produce the F-22 Raptor. Mikoyan's bureau was chosen to lead EMFI, beginning work on what became the MiG-144. Sukhoi, however, was not satisfied with playing a supporting role. What many people outside aviation history don't realize is how long the Soviets had been preparing for a moment like this. Since the 1940s, Soviet engineers had quietly collected data, studied foreign prototypes, and refined aerodynamic models of forward-swept designs. By the late 1980s, they had accumulated decades of theory, but still lacked the materials and the funding to do anything with it. Then came a turning point. The Grumman X-29 had demonstrated that forward-swept wings were not a dead end after all. Composite manufacturing was becoming more accessible. Computerized flight control systems were finally powerful enough to stabilize inherently unstable designs. The technology gap that had stalled the USSR for decades was closing. Inside Sukhoi, this realization was explosive. The Bureau's chief designers began to believe that they could do what even the Germans could not. They could build a forward-swept wing fighter, a real fighter, not an experimental toy, and they could build it soon. As the Soviet Union entered its final years, Sukhoi began drafting concepts that combined everything they had learned from previous research with newly emerging composite technologies. Even though the state chose Mikoyan for the official 5th generation program, Sukhoi recognized an opportunity. If they could prove the concept first, they might reclaim leadership of the next era in Soviet, soon Russian aviation. When the Soviet Union collapsed, most would have expected these dreams to disappear. Funding evaporated, factories shut down, and engineers were struggling to feed their families. But in an unexpected twist of history, the collapse actually became the catalyst. Without state oversight or strict program requirements, Sukhoi was freer than ever to pursue its own experimental vision. For the first time, they were not designing for the Navy, or for a government tender, or for political prestige. They were designing for the future. And so, drawing inspiration from the Ju-287, learning from the X-29, and building upon nearly 50 years of theoretical research, Sukhoi prepared to take a step no other Russian bureau dared to attempt. The forward-swept wing would become the heart of their new secret project, the project that would soon be known as the S-37. A design born in the 1940s, proven in the 1980s, and resurrected in the turmoil of the 1990s, was finally ready to evolve into something extraordinary. By the late 1980s, the Soviet aviation world was divided into two great empires, Mikoyan and Sukhoi. For decades, MiG had been the reigning champion of frontline fighters. The MiG-21, MiG-23, MiG-29, these were the machines that shaped Cold War skies. Sukhoi, meanwhile, was respected but viewed as the builder of heavier, more specialized aircraft, interceptors, attack jets, naval variants. So when the Soviet government launched the MFI program, a contest to create a next-generation fighter that would match or surpass America's ATFO program, everyone assumed Mikoyan would win, and indeed they did. The MiG designers received the funding, the political backing, and the mandate to build the USSR's future air superiority fighter. Inside Sukhoi, the mood was grim. Years of work on advanced concepts, including the early forward-swept wing research, had been pushed aside. The Bureau's future hung in the balance. If Mikoyan succeeded with the MiG-144, Sukhoi risked being demoted to second-tier status for decades to come. But then came 1991. The Soviet Union fell apart, and with it, the financial foundation of the entire defense industry. The MFI program collapsed under budget cuts almost immediately. The MiG Bureau, once a giant, found itself unable to test its prototype, let alone bring it into production. Factories stopped receiving parts. Engine deliveries were delayed. The once mighty program was reduced to life support. Sukhoi realized something that MiG had not. In the new Russia, survival belonged to those who could innovate without waiting for government money. And so, in the smoke-filled conference rooms of a failing economy, Sukhoi leadership made a decision that would shift the balance of Russian aviation for decades. They would revive their most radical idea. They would build a forward-swept wing fighter, secretly, independently, and without asking for state permission. It was a gamble of historic proportions. Few companies in the world had ever funded a full fighter prototype out of their own pocket. The closest parallel was Boeing's risky pursuit of the 707 in the 1950s, a bet that nearly bankrupted the company but ultimately transformed global aviation. Sukhoi was now attempting something just as bold, but with far fewer resources and in a country sinking into economic crisis. Yet, strangely, the turmoil of the 1990s offered a peculiar kind of freedom. Many government restrictions on design experimentation disappeared. Engineers who once worked on classified programs were now underemployed, available, and hungry for a challenge. Empty workshops could be repurposed. Retired test pilots returned for one last great project. And so was born the fighter known internally as S-37. The design began with fragments salvaged from earlier Soviet-era concepts. Aerodynamic studies, incomplete prototypes, composite material experiments, and technologies originally intended for the Su-27K naval programs. Sukhoi engineers merged these elements into a single extraordinary vision, a jet that combined old Soviet robustness with radically new ideas inspired by global research. It wasn't just the wing that made the S-37 revolutionary. The entire aircraft was engineered around the concept of extreme maneuverability and high-angle flight. The forward-swept wings demanded precise computer-controlled stabilization. The engines had to deliver enormous thrust while remaining compatible with a limited budget. Composite materials had to be manufactured using Russian methods, which were less refined than those in the West. And still, the team pushed forward. The cockpit took cues from the experimental Su-47 flanker, side stick controls, digital displays, and a glass layout uncommon in Russian fighters of the time. The fuselage blended elements of the Su-27 family with entirely new structures needed to support the unconventional aerodynamics. To save money, the landing gear was borrowed directly from the Su-27, one of many necessary shortcuts. Each step forward came with setbacks. Funding dried up mid-project more than once. Engineers worked months without pay. Tools had to be refurbished, scavenged, or improvised. Components shipped from factories that often didn't know if they would be open the next week. But what kept the project alive was not money. It was pride. For the Sukhoi Bureau, the S-37 was more than an experiment. It was proved that they could challenge MiG's dominance and reclaim their place at the top of Russian aviation. It was a chance to leapfrog an entire generation of technology and create something no one else in the world dared to build: a fully functional forward-swept wing fighter. By 1996, after years of quiet development, the prototype finally began to take shape inside a hangar outside Moscow. It was sleek, predatory, unmistakably different from any Russian aircraft before it. Its long fuselage, massive canards, and wings that swept aggressively forward made it look almost alive, like a bird of prey caught mid-dive. The engineers gave it a fitting nickname, Berkut, the Golden Eagle. And on a crisp September day in 1997, with only a handful of people watching, the S-37 lifted off the runway for the very first time. Against every financial, political, and technological obstacle, Sukhoi had done what many believed impossible. They had built a forward-swept wing fighter, and it flew. This triumph wasn't just a victory over physics. It was a victory over history itself. The Bureau had officially re-entered the fifth-generation race. The duel with MiG was no longer theoretical. The future of Russian aviation had shifted, and the world was about to notice. When the S-37, soon to be redesignated the Su-47, rolled out onto the runway, it looked like something the world was not supposed to see yet. Even among seasoned test pilots and engineers who had spent their careers around experimental aircraft, the Golden Eagle seemed unreal. Razor-sharp canards, a long predatory fuselage, and wings that bent forward as if defying every rule in the aviation manuals they grew up studying. And now, for the first time, this strange hybrid of Soviet legacy and futurist engineering was about to reveal whether it could truly fly, or whether the skeptics had been right all along. On that day in 1997, the atmosphere was tense. Russia was still clawing its way out of economic freefall. Defense budgets were scraps. Some technicians had walked into the hangar straight from night shifts at second jobs. Yet, as the S-37 accelerated down the runway, the noise of history drowned out everything else. When its wheels lifted from the ground, the impossible happened. The Soviet dream that had survived collapse, budget starvation, internal rivalry, and 30 years of theoretical research had finally taken flight. But flight was just the beginning, a machine unlike any other. Once airborne, the Su-47 revealed why Sukhoi had fought so fiercely to build it. The forward-swept wing didn't simply work, it transformed the aircraft's behavior in ways that designers had hoped for but never fully experienced. Where traditional wings lose lift and stability at high angles of attack, the Su-47 remained controllable. Where conventional aircraft suffered from drag in tight turns, the Berkut sliced through the air like a blade. Pilots described the sensation as unnatural, effortless, and unlike any flanker-type aircraft ever flown. This was no mere paper project. It was a technological leap. The secret lay in the construction. About 90% of the wing's surface was made of advanced composite materials, allowing it to resist the twisting forces that had doomed the German Ju-287 in the 1940s. Russia had finally mastered what earlier generations could only dream of, and this mastery extended far beyond the wings. The power within the Su-47 was powered by two Soloviev D-30F6 engines, the same power plants used in the MiG-31 Interceptor, engines known for their brute force and reliability. Each produced over 93 kN of thrust, giving the Berkut the raw power it needed to reach reported speeds of Mach 2.1-2.2, depending on configuration. There were even early concepts for 2D and 3D thrust vectoring nozzles, which would have turned the aircraft into a maneuverability monster rivaling later fifth-generation fighters. While these concepts never matured into the prototype, they demonstrated the scale of Sukhoi's ambition. This jet wasn't meant to be good enough. It was meant to be groundbreaking, a futuristic weapon system. Though the Su-47 never entered the combat service, its weapons concepts were remarkably advanced. Unlike the American F-22 or F-35, which relied on internal base with doors that open outward, the Berkut used a rotating internal launcher, similar to the mechanism used on strategic bombers for cruise missiles. This allowed the aircraft to deploy R-77 air-to-air missiles quickly, while retaining lower radar visibility. Its wings were also designed with two hardpoints for external stores, or fuel tanks, providing a hybrid of stealth and practicality. A 30mm GSH-31 cannon was planned as standard armament, ensuring the aircraft retained the dogfighting capability even in close quarters. Shaping the invisible. Early stealth elements. While not a true stealth aircraft, the Su-47 incorporated features aimed at lowering its radar cross-section, S-shaped air ducts that helped conceal the engine compressor blades, composite materials that absorbed some radar energy, internal weapons carriage reducing reflective surfaces, careful shaping of the fuselage and intakes. Its stealth was nowhere near the F-22's, but it marked a significant step forward for Russian low observability research. The test flights, triumph and trouble. Between 1997 and 2002, the Su-47 completed over 150 test flights. At air shows, especially its dramatic appearance at MAX 1999, it stunned audiences. Western analysts stared in disbelief as the aircraft performed maneuvers that should have been aerodynamically impossible. But with every triumph came a reminder of reality. The forward-swept wings, revolutionary as they were, still posed challenges. At high speeds approaching Mach 2, the stress on the wings increased dramatically. Even with modern composites, the engineering margins were razor thin. Structural reinforcements added weight. Weight reduced performance. Each solution created another problem, and above everything loomed one constant enemy. Russia did not have the money. By 2001, the aircraft was officially redesignated Su-47, signaling recognition of its importance. But the Kremlin was already shifting attention to a new program, PAK-EFA, the project that would eventually become the Su-57. The Berkut, as a prototype, would not become a frontline fighter. Instead, it would become something arguably more valuable, a flying laboratory, a test bed for the future. Over the next several years, the Su-47 was used to test new radar systems, electronic warfare suites, fly-by-wire algorithms, composite materials, aerodynamic concepts later used on the Su-57 cockpit layouts and pilot interface technologies. It became one of the most important experimental platforms in post-Soviet aviation history, even if only a handful of people realized it at the time. The aircraft flew quietly, away from cameras, gathering data that would eventually guide the next generation of Russian fighters. By the late 2000s, that mission was nearly complete. The Berkut had done what it was built to do, prove that Russia could still innovate, still compete, and still push the boundaries of aerospace engineering. It had shown that even in an age of economic collapse and industrial decline, Russian aviation still had sparks of brilliance left. The wings that once seemed the wrong way around had pointed Russia toward its future. The Su-47 was never meant to retire quietly. It was born from defiance, raised in crisis, and carried on its wings the weight of an entire nation's aviation dreams. And yet, as the years passed, it became clear that this remarkable, almost mythical aircraft would never enter serial production. But to understand why and what the Golden Eagle truly left behind, we must look beyond the prototype itself and into the vast shadow it cast across Russian aerospace development. A moment of triumph and a turning point in Russian aviation. By the early 2000s, Sukhoi had pulled off something extraordinary. They had built a next-generation aircraft without government funding during one of the most turbulent economic periods in modern Russian history. They had kept their design bureau alive, outmaneuvered their powerful rival MiG, and demonstrated technologies no Russian fighter had ever attempted. But the question remained, what comes next? Russia needed a real production fighter, not just a research machine. The government could not afford two competing experimental programs. The country's military doctrine was shifting, and survival meant standardization, affordability, and long-term planning. The Su-47, with all its brilliance, was an engineering moon landing, a symbol of what was possible, but not what was practical. And while Sukhoi had achieved incredible breakthroughs, the Golden Eagle had also revealed the harsh truths of forward-swept wing design. High-speed flight placed enormous stress on the wings. Composite manufacturing remained complex and expensive. Maintenance requirements were high, the aerodynamic advantages were significant, but narrow in scope. The Su-47 soared, but it soared in a way that was difficult to mass-produce. The fall of MiG and the rise of Sukhoi. By 2002, Russia officially cancelled the MFI and LFI programs. MiG's 144, once the great hope of Soviet future aviation, flew a single demonstration flight and was quietly retired to a museum. The political winds had shifted decisively. Sukhoi had won, not because the Su-47 was chosen as the next fighter, it wasn't, but because the Golden Eagle proved something more important. Sukhoi could innovate when no one else could. Its success gave Sukhoi credibility, leverage, and influence at the exact moment when the Kremlin was preparing to launch its most important aviation initiative since the fall of the USSR. The program that would become PAK-EFA, Government committees evaluating the future of Russian aviation looked at the Su-47 and saw more than a prototype. They saw a bureau that could deliver even without funding, even in chaos, even when every other program had collapsed. The decision was made. Sukhoi, not MiG, would develop Russia's first true fifth-generation fighter. This single decision reshaped the entire landscape of Russian aerospace for the next 25 years. Why the Su-47 was never chosen. The Golden Eagle had heart, soul, and revolutionary engineering, but the PKFA program required something different: stability, reliability, a design that was future-proof and not dependent on exotic manufacturing. Sukhoi engineers understood this better than anyone, and many of them had come to see the Su-47 not as a production fighter, but as a stepping stone. Several factors sealed its fate. 1. Forward-swept wings were too expensive for serial production. Even with modern composites, the costs were prohibitively high. Russia's aerospace industry in the 2000s could not sustain mass production of such structures. 2. Stealth requirements were changing. The Su-47's layout, while innovative, was not ideal for reducing radar cross-section. The global aviation community was entering the age of stealth shaping, and the Su-47's dramatic curves made radar suppression difficult. 3. Engine limitations. The Die-30F6 engines were powerful but outdated. New generation engines would require a redesign of the entire aircraft. 4. Mission scope had evolved. The 21st century demanded multi-role capabilities, deep strike, advanced sensors, network-centric warfare. The Su-47 was optimized for maneuverability and aerodynamic research, not for the broad mission profile required of a frontline fighter. In the end, the Su-47 was a monument to what was technologically possible, but not strategically necessary. The birth of Russia's first stealth fighter with the PAK-FA program underway, Sukhoi engineers began incorporating the lessons learned from the Su-47, flight control algorithms, composites manufacturing stealth-compatible internal layouts, cockpit ergonomics, high agility, aerodynamic concepts, use of canards and dynamic control surfaces, integration of new generation avionics. Even though the Su-57 looks nothing like the Su-47, its DNA is unmistakable. Engineers who worked on the Golden Eagle often described it as a classroom in the sky, a flying experiment that taught them how to build a true fifth-generation aircraft. Without the Su-47, the Su-57 would not exist. This is not an exaggeration. It is a documented truth inside Sukhoi's own design history. The final years of the Golden Eagle. As the 2000s progressed, the Su-47 transitioned fully into a test platform. It was used for new radar systems, high-stress composite evaluations, cockpit software testing, electronic warfare experiments, aerodynamic trials for stealth shaping potential canard design concepts, flight control stress testing. Its flights became less frequent but more meaningful. Every sortie added new data to the massive archive that would eventually support the Su-57's development. By 2009, with the PKFA prototype approaching completion, the Su-47's mission had finally ended. The Golden Eagle made a public appearance, one of its last, at MAX 2009, where aviation fans, engineers, and former test pilots gathered around it in quiet reverence. It was no longer a mystery, no longer a secret project, no longer the future. It had become something rarer, a legend, a legacy larger than the aircraft itself. Today, the Su-47 is often misunderstood. Some see it as a failed prototype, others view it as an oddity of post-Soviet experimentation. But those interpretations miss the deeper truth. The Su-47 was not designed to win wars. It was designed to win the future. It secured Sukhoi's dominance at a critical moment. It saved Russia's advanced fighter research from extinction. It bridged the gap between Soviet-era aerospace science and modern fifth-generation engineering. And more than anything, it stands as a testament to the stubbornness, brilliance, and sheer willpower of the engineers who refused to give up, even when there was no money, no political support, and no guarantee that their work would ever be recognized. In a decade defined by collapse, the Golden Eagle rose. In an era of uncertainty, it flew. And though it never carried missiles into battle, it carried the hopes of Russian aviation through one of the darkest periods in its history. The Su-47 did not become the fighter of tomorrow, but it ensured Russia would have one. And that is a legacy worthy of any aircraft that ever took to the skies.